Oh, thanks, Ken. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Well, I appreciate being here with each of you. I told them I didn't need the mic, but they said that it's kind of standard. I feel like I'm taking a drive-through order, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, what was that? Yeah, exactly. You want fries? Yeah. So for us today, as Ken has asked my husband Tony and I to kind of partner with him because of areas that we're involved in. This is something that we experience on a daily basis, unfortunately, in terms of opportunities to de escalate. And so this morning in church, Rob had made the comment that if you're married, you work on de escalation. If you have kids, if you are out in public, if you're in traffic, we work on de escalation behaviors. And so today it's definitely relevant because of the horrific events that have happened in our country, but it's also about increasing situational awareness. And so for you to say that's something's off, but then not just to say something's off and leave, but to say something's off and actually engage appropriately. And that's what we're talking about in here today. So how can we, in the face of a disruptive event or a disruptive individual, how can we act in a way that's going to be honoring not only to the people around us, but then also to what we want to do, which is to honor God in the way that we carry ourselves. So a couple of things to get started. I want to make sure this is working. I think it is. Yeah, good. So we want to do a couple of things from an objectives end of it. So we're going to introduce the concept of what's called verbal and nonverbal de-escalation. Ken and I were joking about how a lot of people refer to it as verbal de-escalation or talking someone down. It's nearly impossible to communicate just verbally, meaning that a lot of times our body language, what your eyes are doing, what your face is doing, what the tone of your voice is doing, all of those things are going to speak into what you're feeling in that moment. And so for us, it's about how do we verbally and non-verbally use different tools that God has given us through our communication to help us to de-escalate the situation. So there's a number of different things that we're going to cover. You can talk about up there, or you can see up there to teach you the basic skills that you need to stay calm and diffuse potentially difficult situations. In addition to that, though, I talk about to give you the opportunity to observe and practice overall verbal and nonverbal de-escalation skills. So Ken told me that this is a chatty bunch. So I'm looking forward to listening to you. I have my dad's here, and he said it's 2 hours. I said, oh yeah, I'm not talking for 2 straight hours. They're going to give me a bunch of that too. So I look forward to leaning on you for your expertise and your examples as well, and then being able to refine that is our ultimate goal today. So this other information, Ken told me you're familiar with. You've seen it a few times in terms of copyright information of what we're talking about today. Notices and disclaimers. The things that we're going to tell you today are things that are research that we have personal experience in and have worked at times, but we want to be very straightforward in saying this is substance. These are ideas for you to add to your pack to make you prepared or culturally prepared. However, we're not saying that this is a 7-step process to ensure 100% safety. This is information that you need to take and that you can do with it in terms of allowing yourself to be aware of, okay, I have a little bit of knowledge on this. I teach at Indiana Wesleyan, and before every beginning semester, I have my husband, who's a former Secret Service agent, walk into every class with me and say, okay, Tone, not that I ever want to have a situation where I have to get kids out of here and myself. What do I do? What are the points? Where do I go? And when I was at Taylor, same thing. And Tony would walk me through how to do that. And it wasn't because I ever expected or thought that that was going to happen, but if it did, I know myself well. And I know most of the time I would freeze unless I have a plan and unless I feel like I am somewhat prepared. So today is going to be about increasing your awareness and understanding of those things, right? In addition to that, though, here's kind of our agenda. So Ken also told me that you're note takers. So I want to make sure I give you plenty of that today. Overall, we're going to define, I'm a big define the terms. We can say de-escalation, we can say verbal and nonverbal, but making sure we all have an understanding of what that means, not just from me, but from your own experience is critical. In addition to that, we're going to look at how do we engage with a disruptive person. I want to be very clear. That does not mean if there's a disruptive person that you automatically have to engage. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is if you feel that you are in a situation with a disruptive person, here's a plan on what you can do, okay? In addition to that, though, we're also going to talk about verbal and nonverbal strategies, maintaining personal control, which sounds okay right now on a Sunday where the sun is finally shining and we can maintain personal control in here. But all sorts of things happen to our bodies, both physically and mentally, when we are triggered. And how do we then act in a way that's going to be effective and also authentic to ourselves in that moment? And then finally, we'll have a little bit of time for some reviews and some questions and those types of things. So Ken encouraged me to do an icebreaker activity. And so I like this idea because it allows you to get your juices flowing, which is good on a Sunday afternoon, especially if you had a big lunch. And so for us, we want to make sure that we're grounded in Scripture and understanding and kind of going to that initially, as opposed to something that our secular culture would say is what we should do. So up there you can see with me in Matthew 5:9 talks about blessed are the peacemakers. And ultimately, for they will be called children of God. And then if you go down and you see that it talks about in 1 Thessalonians, Rob actually did this. Was this 3 weeks ago, Rob? I think it was about 3 weeks ago. He said this. I was paying attention, and he said this in the service, and I said, okay, this is something I want to write down and make sure that we connect with. And so this verse stood out to me because it said, but let us who live in the light think clearly, which in times of disruption and chaos, it is very difficult to think clearly. And so, but those of us who live in the light that think clearly, protected by the body armor of faith and love, and wearing as our helmet the confidence of salvation. So a few words, I'm a big word person, communication is my background, and so I latched on to peacemaker, and I latched on to confidence. So there's a lot of messages swirling around about what it means to be confident. And so confident, people treat it like it's a pair of pants that you put on, or it's like your hat. But for us in particular, confidence is having the sense of self and awareness, knowing who you are as a unique creation of God, knowing what your strengths are, knowing what your weaknesses are, and being able to assess those in the time of disruption. Who am I, and how can I help in this situation? So to get us started, I just thought it might be fun for you to get to know a couple of people around you. And so what I'd like you to do is, I'd love for you to find 2 or 3 other people that you don't know, or if you do, that's fine, and to reintroduce yourself or introduce yourself. And then I'd like, as a group, for you to go around and for you to talk about what is a peacemaker. When you hear the word peacemaker, what pops in your head? And it can be an actual person, or it can be traits or characteristics. And then the second thing I want you to focus on, or to talk about with your new friends, is what does it mean to have confidence? And it can be anything. So it can be something that's nonverbal, or it can be something that's verbal. It could be a person that you see that you're like, wow, they are a really confident person. And to begin to understand, why do you think that individual is confident? And so then we'll come back and find out some of your main points. So if you would kindly find a couple of people and to talk about peacemaker and confidence, and then we'll get started. Please go ahead. If we can come back. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Lael. Sorry about that. Good. I know you guys are supposed to be watching this, right? No, I'm just kidding. All right, so I know, right? Okay, so what did you talk about that you thought was interesting? Now, when I ask this in my classes, most of my students are super chatty, and then when they come back as a whole, and I say, "What did you talk about? What was interesting?" It's like crickets chirping. You know, you can't hear, or you can. Nobody wants to talk. So I'd love. I mean, this is we've got some time. We've got a lot to get through, but it's definitely going to stick more if you help me. And so I'd love to hear what your group has talked about. So when you think about peacemaker, what were some words that popped into your brain or examples of people who were peacemakers? Katerina. Right, right. That's a great answer. So the idea of being calm and being able to think through clearly. So when we think about, and then she even extra credit points. Katerina is one of my students right now, so she even swooped in confidence in that too. But if you think about a peacemaker, so calm, thinking clearly, those are good places to start. What else? What else did your group talk about? I'm sure most of the group said calm, but what else do you have? Yep, good. Somebody who's objective and not biased. Why would that be important? Why would it be important for somebody to be objective and not biased in that kind of situation for peacemaking? What was it? Right, exactly. There's two sides. And so, although we have those wonderful biases, and our biases can be obtained both verbally and non verbally, somebody talks well or somebody looks good, chances are that's going to impact what we think about them. Well, in a true peacemaking course, it's not just about seeing one side and going with your bias, but it's about representing both sides. That's good. What else? When you think of peacemaker, anything else? Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk about that a bit today when you think about listen. So, the majority of your daily life, chances are you're listening. And so, a lot of people believe that listening and hearing are synonymous, and they're absolutely not. It couldn't be further from the truth because listening requires you to engage. It's intentional. I mean, for the next few minutes that we're together, you can listen, but you're really just hearing my voice coming through the mic, the wah, wah, wah. Hopefully, it doesn't sound like that yet. But the idea that you actually have to connect, you have to pay attention to what the person is saying, and you have to listen. So that's another big one, too. What about confidence? Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Right. And so asking for that discernment or filter in terms of, okay, let's say you've had a hairy day, and I mean, your day is just crazy, and that's definitely going to have the capacity to impact how you would inhale or take in that information, as opposed to if you take a second, and then we'll talk about counting to 10 and the importance of that. And it's not to practice your counting skills, it's to allow yourself to come down, it's allow yourself to maintain balance or equilibrium in who you are and to get that kind of sense of self to listen. So that's really good too. Yep. Yeah, that's not, you've been paying attention to what he's saying. So stop and assess and then go from there. Exactly right. Good. What about confidence? What did your group talk about with confidence or an example of somebody who's confident? You were, you were unsure? Thank you. All right, so what's the peanut gallery back there? What was that? We got cut off. I know this instructor up here didn't give you enough time. Well, what do you think of? We can have a big group discussion. What do you think of when you hear the word confident? Okay. And how do we know? And projecting that, right? So how do we know what to do next in a situation? What was that? Training, exactly right. Or just experience or knowledge. Go ahead. Hmm. Absolutely. And how so? Because a lot of times people say confidence, and to go back to what I was saying earlier about putting your pants on, or it's something that it's like, I'm confidence is like a posture, but yet we also can regard that as arrogance. So what's the difference? That's a good point. Right. Hmm. Right. And that's where we're going with this idea of being sure of yourself as much as you can to help you become better acquainted with the situation and your role in that situation. Yep.
In the profession I was in, the confidence that I needed and I acquired came from being a Christian, attempting to live a life with Christ, knowing that there was redemption for the mistakes I would make, and I would end up in the kingdom of heaven. And it was that simple because I was doing things that, yeah, and that's where I gained my confidence.
Right, right, exactly. Well, and we think about peacemaker and we think about confidence because that's what this idea of how to de escalate is going to require you to do. It's going to require you to seek peace in the situation, but it's also going to require you to know yourself well enough to say, how can I, me, Linda, be able to use the skills and the gifts that I've been given to apply to this situation and de escalate it? And it's going to be different for each one of us in terms of how we choose to engage. But the idea is that we have these sets and these skills that will help us along the way. So when you think about the relevance, in my classes, a lot of times I'll say to students, this is relevant and here's why. So I don't want to mess that up with you. I want to make sure you understand why you're relevant and why this is relevant. So disruptive behavior, unfortunately, is all too common in our society. So when you think about disruptive behavior, there's a pretty big spectrum that disruptive behavior would be defined on. So it could be anything from somebody shouting or saying something out of the norm. In our family, we call them schema violations, or just something that's a little bit off that doesn't normally happen in that particular setting. So here are some examples, obviously, in our society, whether it's in our society in terms of even in churches, in schools, in grocery stores, any of those kind of public places, but in addition to that, too, in our homes. And a lot of times we define what a disruptive behavior is because of what we've been taught. So if you came from a home that shouting was the norm, you're not going to be disrupted by shouting. But if you came from a home that's a little bit, has a different take on shouting, you're going to have a different reaction. So we think about domestic disputes, substance abuse can definitely lead to some sort of disruptive. If a person is out of control because of some overuse of a substance, that's obviously going to impact them. The idea of protesters or a situation where people are emotionally charged and feel like they have not been listened to. So it's kind of the perfect storm where they're going to come out and use some sort of disruptive behavior. I put up there this idea of traffic and traveling. I don't know about you, but I have this wonderful ability to always get pulled out of line at TSA. Every time. And I don't know why. I really try to just, I don't necessarily try to engage or try to draw attention, but most of the time I've done something where I need to be just checked. And so over the years, I've decided to not take on any kind of posture or resemblance of a disruptive person on purpose because I want to go on my vacation or I want to get on the plane or I want to go home, one of those different things. But I put on there traffic. This was just on Friday. We were driving to Hartford City. And I was driving, and I had my kids in the car, and my mom was with me. And we were driving on the back roads to Hartford City, and over on the right-hand side on one of the roads was a pickup truck with a trailer that was crooked in the road. It just looked off. And so the individual then gunned the car and started to approach their stop sign. But we didn't have a stop sign, but I saw them coming. So I slowed way down and just kind of gained control of the vehicle, of course, and then went to the side. And what I saw was the individual continued to go through the stop sign and then slammed on his brakes as we went by. And I looked as we're passing, and I watched the individual looking out the side and then in my rearview mirror was out of control in his car, window down, hand gestures to me that I had to explain to our children, yelling and saying different things that we don't say in our house. And my youngest said to me, "Whoa, that was weird, Mom." And I said, thank you. I'm glad of all the things you just heard and listened to, weird is the only word that you're going to come back with. And so this idea of disruptive behavior, I have a number of stories like that. I was at Meijer, but I was at Meijer the other day, and it was kind of cold out, and I was getting in my car, and so I was loading up the groceries, and I have a back door on my truck. And so I noticed this car coming through the parking lot that was extremely loud, rattling, and there was loud music, and it was disruptive, meaning it was different than the normal kind of goings-on that I've been conditioned to in the parking lot at Meijer at 3 o'clock on a weekday. So I didn't really think very much about it. I always park next to the cart retrieval areas because usually I have kids in the car and I don't want to leave them, and I don't want to be not a nice person and put my cart and not take it back. And so anyway, I was loading my last bag into the car, and I noticed that this car had now come down and turned extremely sharp into the parking space next to me. And I noticed that the rear window on the driver's side had plastic over it and was duct taped. And something inside of me was like, that's off. Linda, get your stuff in your car and let's get going. So push the button, tailgate's going down, turn my cart around and to put it in, and I noticed as I looked through my driver's side to the passenger side window, there is a man standing at my passenger side window, banging on the car, saying, lady, 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 lady. And so I've got my key fob in my hand, and I thought, if I click unlock, he could get in. I'm not going to click unlock. I've got my key. I'm going to put my key in there. I'm going to get in the car, and I'm going to leave. And that's exactly what I did. I had no idea what that man was going to do, but I know that my dad has never greeted me that way. And I know my husband has never greeted me that way. And I know in my interactions in society, normally people who want to have a fruitful interaction don't begin that way. So one of the reason I'm telling all those stories to you is that happened at a 3 o'clock at Meijer on a weekday. So disruptive behaviors are happening. I'm not encouraging you to flee, but I'm not encouraging you to engage when you feel threatened. So, I mean, we have to apply that logic today as we're going through our situation together. So the relevance of this is it's happening. And what are we going to do as we continue? So Ken and I and my husband, Tony, have some ideas. So let's talk a little bit about, to kind of get our feet wet in terms of what de-escalation is going to be. So it's going to be a skill that you're going to have. And the skill is going to do the following things. So it's going to be used to get control of the situation. Not control so you can, have all the powers of the universe, but control in terms of something's disruptive, people could get hurt, what are we going to do? So when you think about the idea of it's the opportunity to manage routine interactions so that subjects don't become agitated or combative. So when you hear the word agitated, what do you think of? What was it? Washing machine? Yeah, mine doesn't have that. It's the weirdest thing. Right. Okay, so when you think about agitated, besides washing machine, what do you think of? Upset. Okay, what else? That's good. Frustrated, right? So agitated, frustrated, upset. So the goal is what happens to us in individuals when we start to feel that way for whatever reason, we tend to lose control of who we are. Our thoughts, controls of our bodies, and the opportunity to engage in a way that's going to be reflective of the light as opposed to the darkness that unfortunately has its way of finding us pretty quickly. When you think about successful de-escalation, it's going to calm. So you talked to me about peacemakers. You talked to me about that idea of confidence before. It's also going to encourage the subject to cooperate. So we're going to talk about the individual in terms of the other as a subject, not to demean them as a creation of God, but as we move forward, subject, I want to make sure we're clean on what that means. It's also going to reduce the likelihood of injury or violence, which should be the goal. And finally, it's going to treat the subject ultimately with respect, which is extremely difficult to do. When somebody seems disruptive, violates the norm, for me, when I have my children with us and we're somewhere and somebody is being disrespectful, I remember we were at the Dollar Smart and there was a man who was using profanity to one of the women that was checking the bags or the products out. And my husband leaned in and said, I have my children here. I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't speak like that. And he turned and looked at Tony, who was taller than him, and said, okay. I don't know if it was because Tony was taller than him. I don't know what it was, other than I was glad that it stopped. And so when we think about how do we treat somebody with respect that is frustrating or bothering us, our natural reaction is not to treat someone with respect who's bothering us. And I'm not going to blame sin, but a lot of times we get all agitated and frustrated, and what comes out of our mouth is usually, the first thing that comes out of our mouth is not usually that fruitful. Ken showed me this image, And I appreciated it because from a visual end of it, it's going to kind of highlight a number of things for us. It's going to use color to help us understand what is a little bit, obviously, what would be more effective, and then kind of get into the red zone, or red in terms of a little bit more fiery and perhaps unproductive. So when we think about de-escalation, we're going to look at it from a more effective to a less effective spectrum. So when do we use this? Well, when do you use different types of de-escalation? So we have up there general threats, verbal threats, violent threats, weapon threats. And so that's a pretty interesting pack. When you think of when you want to use de-escalation, understanding that, I mean, you've chosen to engage, and we'll talk about that in different steps, but when I'm in a situation, what do I do? And am I going to do something that's general, or am I going to do something that's going to up it a little bit and make it more personal, or use my verbal language to tell that person some pretty intense language in that way? Am I going to be violent, or am I going to use a weapon? So there are other things that can fall in there, but these are some pretty good categories to stick into your brain with the image of the goal is to be effective. And how do we do that? Ken noted in here, and we were working on this a bit. So when you think about level 1, which are general threats, you don't want to alarm or agitate the subject any more than what they're already doing. But you do need, if you've chosen to engage, you do need to communicate to them. So an example of this would be somebody kind of hanging around suspiciously in a stairwell, or just something's a little bit off, or someone trying to get into a locked car in the parking lot. It could be their car, but we all know the demeanor of somebody who's trying to get in their car as opposed to somebody who's trying to get into somebody else's car, okay? Or a teenager who appears to be going through the pockets of a coat in the cloakroom. There's a lot of clever people out there, and I use clever somewhat sarcastically in terms of how they can actually get us to identify that something is off. So you don't want a routine situation to, that has a perfectly reasonable explanation to blow up on someone. So an example of this. So again, at Meijer, I don't know why all these things happen at Meijer, but I guess where I spend my time. So anyway, I'm in Meijer, and I'm by the fruit section. I'm in Muncie this time. Okay, so I'm at the fruit section, and I see an older gentleman standing by this apple display. And I'm going to look and inhale non-verbally, take in his posture. He's been there a while. He's kind of looking around, eye contact, maybe a little bit frantic. And I'm thinking, he's lost, or he needs some help. And I'm the product, so go back to where I'm from, I'm the product of wonderful grandparents. And I care for my grandparents, cared for them, cared for my parents, all those different types of things. I didn't believe he looked threatening, so I did take a second to assess that because I understand who I am. And so I walked up to him and I said, "Excuse me, sir," instead of "Hey," or instead of "What are you doing?" or "Are you lost?" My favorite question, right? So I said, "Excuse me, sir," and I had my cart in front of me too. I said, "Excuse me, sir." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Is everything okay?" And he goes, "Yes, I'm just waiting for my wife. She said she was going for milk, and she's just not back. She's probably in the candy aisle." And I said, "I would probably be in the candy aisle too, sir." And he smiled, and I said, I'm sorry if it seems that I was disrespectful. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." And he said, "Nope." He's like, "I'm fine. Thank you." I said, "Thank you," and I walked away. Now, understanding in the grocery store at Meijer, an elderly gentleman, it was out of place, but the manner in which I chose to engage is not to pat myself on the back, but I thought about it, and I had the time to think about it. Now, if it was a situation that you would deem more disruptive, maybe that would change, but the idea is still the same in that the process we go through. What? It was not Cliff. I know Cliff. I would have gone up to him. All right, so I want to make sure that we're clear on in terms of general threats and verbal threats. There's some good stuff down here I definitely want to share with you. Verbal threats at level 2 are situations in which a subject's behavior is affecting himself, this is the important part, or others that is hurtful. Okay, so this is obviously going to be more level 2 verbal threat. So it's going to be hurtful, embarrassing, annoying, or unpredictable. So, I mean, just go with me on that list for a second. So, it's when you're out in public and there's individuals yelling at each other. So, it's disruptive, and they're saying names, and they don't even really pay attention to who's around them. But that's different than something that's a little out of the ordinary. So, you can see how that's progressively getting a bit more intense. Level 3 threats are extremely important because they're violent threats. There's no weapons present, but there's definitely going to involve physical threats in some capacity, right? When I was a student in undergrad, I had the opportunity to do some of my teaching in juvie. And I remember I told my dad, and I asked him, I wasn't going to tell my mom because there was no way my mom was going to let me do that in ever, probably, really. And even to this day, we bring it up, and she doesn't want to hear about it. But one of my favorite things was making sure that I understood the difference between level threats. And I remember the day that I walked in to teach Shakespeare to a group of 16-year-olds that had done things that I read about and was really concerned. And I walked into class, and I was escorted in by the security guard, or by the officer, and he opened up the door and closed it right away. And I said, is something wrong? And he said, I don't think we're going to have class today. And I said, well, why? I mean, what? And I looked in there, and there were 3 of my male students who were on top of one other male student. And he said, I need you to wait outside. And he went in and split them up. And then I waited because those were my students, but I needed to understand what was happening. And because I knew that it had upped, it is a physical threat, it was totally different in terms of a general threat or a verbal threat. Now we were getting into something that was a bit more violent. Obviously, level 4 with weapon threats are obviously, I mean, a weapon is present. That's going to be a pretty significant attention getter. Hopefully, none of you will ever face a situation when you're around that, but obviously the way that you choose to engage is going to reflect at which level of threat you believe is happening, okay? So overall, I'm not sure if I skipped one. That one clicked kind of quick. I just touched it once. But that's kind of pretty. I like that. I didn't put that in there. I did break it. Okay, Lael's going to rescue me. I'm not touching anything. Is this a de-escalation activity on me? Right. So it was right after. Yep, exactly. That's okay. Yep. So I'm after the arrow. Well, while he's doing that, I can continue, and then he can just catch up with me. That sounds kind of good. All right, so why don't we, while they're getting that fixed, why don't you help me with something? We'll skip a little bit ahead and focus on nonverbal, and plus I want to get you moving. So I'd love to have 3 volunteers. I won't make you do anything but talk, I promise. Can I get 3 volunteers? Thank you very much, Don. That's one. And come on up here. Oh, hold on. Okay, we'll do 3. So I've got 1. Can I get a second, please? Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate it. Okay, and then a third. Thanks, Katerina. Come on up here. Come on up here. Okay.
Will be nice, maybe. I am?
Just for a minute. Just for a minute. No, this isn't the same one. Let's do a 4th one. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Can I get a 4th one? Perfect. Come on up. Thank you. Don't you like that? I'll get him back, I promise, at some point. Thank you very much for doing that. Okay, so what I've done is I've given each of our volunteers, who I'm very appreciative of them, a strip of paper that's going to have an emotion or a way to carry themselves. And I'm simply going to ask them to say 2 words to you, and that is, I'm sorry. And I want them to think about, based on the emotion or the state that I gave you, how you would do that in a way that would represent how you feel based on what I gave you on that piece of paper. As a group, we're going to determine, because of the way that they not only say the phrase, I'm sorry, but how they say it non-verbally is probably going to encourage you to feel something. So, Katerina, we'll start with you. So if you want to say, I'm sorry, and then we'll try to figure out which emotion you are. Nice and loud for us. Okay, all right, good. So we had an I'm sorry. So what did that make you think of in terms of how Katerina is feeling? Sincere. What else? Embarrassed? Hesitant, not confident. Okay, so what led you to think perhaps hesitant, embarrassed, not confident? I mean, what pieces did you latch onto that kind of caused you to interpret it that way? She backed up. What else? Right. Kind of felt like she didn't really want to say it, like it was almost forced. Okay. So, Katerina, what was your distracted? Okay. So when you think about whether it's an emotion, whether it's a state of being, just objectively or verbally, we all listen to I'm sorry. But non-verbally, it really quickly had a different take rather than I'm sorry. Is it this?
No,
oh, thank you.
We can't hear them at all, so if we want them on the recording, they need to use the mic.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Katerina, you get to do it one more time. No pressure. Tell us I'm sorry one more time, please.
I'm sorry.
All right. Good. Good. So I appreciate that. All right, Don, let's hear it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, and he's adding words. I didn't even tell him he could do that. So we got a, yeah, I'm sorry. Now, Judy, I don't know if you've heard that before with a, yeah, I'm sorry. All the time. So what emotion or what feeling or what did you take away from Don's example? Kind of sarcastic. How so? That's good. Yeah, good. Anything else? Very insincere. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what were you? Sarcastic, yeah. Good, good. All right. Go ahead, Sherry. I know.
I'm sorry.
Ooh, all right, good, good. So what do we think about that one? Oh, come on. Okay, all right, Debbie's onto something. She said she was sorry because she was mad. So if you've ever apologized but you were mad, it might mirror a similar tone because you had angry, correct? Yeah, and I appreciate that you doing it that way. So obviously the tone of voice, the rate, the way she held her body, her facial expressions, these are all things that we do on a daily basis. But they're things that we can learn to use effectively when we're trying to de-escalate a situation, right? So one more, go ahead.
I am sorry.
Oh. They all like you now. They've all, yeah, exactly right, exactly. All right, good. Thank you. Round of applause for our volunteers, please. Thank you, folks. Thank you for doing that. Great, thanks. All right, so I am sorry. So understanding that a lot of times when did they take my clicker? Somebody has to apologize. Oh, okay. All right. So can you slide advance for me? I think slide advance is going to. So keep going. Keep going. Okay. All right. So hold on. Is that the one that I want? Yeah. We'll come back to what we just did and we'll organize it this way. When you have the opportunity to use your nonverbal to de-escalate a situation, that is what the individual or the subject is going to read first. So you can say all that you want, but the majority of the time, the manner in which you say it, what your body is doing, what your face is doing, what your hands are doing, are going to dramatically impact the situation much more than if you are more eloquent than one of the best poets in the world. It's all about how you say it in those first moments than what you say. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Sixth grade teacher. So, when kids do something wrong, not my class because they're awesome, but just saying. No.
Hold on, I have to give you this because Leia will come back down again if I don't. Okay, sorry.
I'm just
I am
curious.
sorry.
When you have kids at school, and you know, you as a teacher, you're always saying, well, you need to say you're sorry, and they don't want to say they're sorry. What do you do?
Well, most of the time I'll ask them why. Not
Right.
in front of the other kids, but I'll try to understand the situation a little bit more. But if someone's like, I don't want to say I'm sorry, okay. So something is under the surface besides just the verbal of I don't want to say I'm sorry. There's something there. So you can push them, and then we're going to get all the other ones, all the sarcastic, all the angry, those different types of things, which are not going to de-escalate the situation. So, I mean, what have you done? That's a great question.
And I usually do. I mean, I'll listen to their side. I'm just thinking of one particular person who seems to be in trouble quite often.
Yeah.
And earlier on in his young elementary life, he would apologize and he would mean it, but now he doesn't mean it usually ever. And he doesn't want to say it because he doesn't feel like he's done anything wrong.
Right.
It's difficult.
It's very difficult. And I mean, at that point, you have now entered into uncovering those different layers of that student's life. And so it's, well, sorry doesn't work anymore. Okay, so we got to figure out why. And that's going to definitely open up a lot more than just, I don't like the word sorry. So, I mean,
There is a lot going on anyway in his life. I get it. Drugs, all that with his family. So I get it. Parents divorced, you know. But it's like, I just want this kid to realize, you know what, you're going to have to do this maybe on your own. You know, with not a whole lot of guidance growing up.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, that's really tough, I think, for everybody that's involved, for sure, for sure. In that situation, and I busted this up into kind of 3 different sections, and again, to give you little bits of information on each in terms of to add some substance about what does this mean. So when you think about, and definitely with the example that was given, you need to approach carefully. So how do we do that? How do you approach carefully? So from a nonverbal end of it, no sudden movements. I mean, we have a stray cat outside of our house right now. You want to talk about sudden movements? I mean, and I understand that's a cat and a person, big difference. But I mean, some of the logic is similar. That if you move suddenly to a person who is amped up, anything could cause them to go off the edge. And that's not the goal. The goal is to get them away from the edge for the safety of all parties, including them involved. Okay? So you want to walk slowly, but here's our word. You want to walk slowly but confidently. What does that mean? What does it mean to, and I'm not talking about a power walk here, but what does it mean to walk slowly and confidently? Does anybody have an idea? Okay. All right, so maybe approaching using your body language in a way that would be more open to try to symbolize we can work through this, or at least put it on the table and let the person know that you're not coming at them in an approach that is going to try to take control in a way where they feel like they're being extremely threatened. In addition to that, avoid shouting at the subject, which is extremely hard, especially if you're nervous, panicked, scared, you fill in the blank. And I tend to be loud anyway, but when I get really amped up, it's like I don't even have to try, and my volume level is off the charts. I know that about who I am, therefore, when I think about approaching carefully, I have to consider that option. One of the things I say to my students a lot, and also to our family and to our kids, is the more you know about yourself, the more effective of a communicator you're going to be. Not talking about being eloquent, but the more that you know. So I know that when I get really amped up, my hands shake, okay? So on the first day of classes, although it's not disruptive, but I'm amped up because I get to meet all these new students, I don't hold the syllabi in my hands because I'll hold paper and then it'll start shaking and the students will go, she's nervous. And I'm like nervous-sighted, but I don't want to necessarily let them know that because in our society, if you're supposedly nervous, it means something different than perhaps what you're truly feeling. In addition, you want to avoid sneaking up on the subject and approach from within the subject's field of vision. Why is that important? Why, when you're approaching carefully, do you want to approach within the subject's field of vision? Right. You don't want to catch them by surprise or startle them. Because what do we do when we're surprised, caught off guard? We react. and usually not in the most, probably more clumsy, perhaps, because we're shocked or we jerk or do those different types of things. In addition to approaching carefully, you want to definitely pay attention to personal space. So you have your personal bubble. That's great. I haven't invaded it too much. If I get over here by Judy, though Judy knows me, this probably wouldn't be too close. But if I decided to teach the entire thing from there, that might be a little overdone at times. So you need to be very aware. You stand about 3 feet away. Normally, research-wise, this is a comfortable distance. In addition to that, you want to stand 5 to 6 feet away if the subject is agitated. So how are you going to tell that? How are you going to tell if somebody's agitated? You look at them. What was it? Exactly. We joke my brother has this vein that comes down. He shaves his head just because he has patches of hair. Anyway, so Brian has this vein that comes down when he gets agitated. And we all knew it as kids growing up. Oh, Brian's agitated. No, I'm not, he would say, and we are like, right there. Okay. You want to avoid touching the subject because a lot of people don't like to be touched by people they don't know. And a lot of times, touch isn't necessarily the best way to de-escalate a situation. It could be in situations if you know the individual. However, rule of thumb is avoid touching because you're going to violate that space that we talked about earlier. Don't allow the subject to crowd your space. So just as much as you want to be respectful of their space, you need to make sure that they are respectful of your space as well. Because if somebody's closing in on you, you're going to start to get amped up and agitated. So you need to be very aware of that. Finally, lowering the threat level. That sounds nice. So lowering the threat level is going to involve the following. You're going to reduce noise and distraction. So as much as you can. So if there's other things that are happening, if you have a cell phone on you, if you have something that could reduce or produce some type of noise, how can we reduce noise or perhaps distraction? If there's a TV on, if there's other kind of external sources of noise. Avoid trapping the subject both verbally and non-verbally. So that has space ramifications to it, but it also, you don't want them to feel like you're engaging in verbal judo. So it's not a fight. It's not about bantering back and forth at this point. You want to make sure that you let one security or safety team member do the talking. Why would this be important? If there's more than just you, the de-escalator in the room, why is it important that only one of you does the talking to the subject? One more time, please. Right. Right. The subject wouldn't feel attacked, 2 people attacking one, double teamed. What else? Confusion, exactly right. So if there's one person doing the talking, it's a same narrative, same theme. And I don't know about you, but if you're in a situation, there's a bunch of people giving ideas, that's nice and a kind of a brainstorming activity. But right now, we're trying to lower the threat level. So how do we do that? We're going to keep it simple. And we're going to allow one person to do the talking. Moving to a private space, if possible, is extremely important as long as you feel comfortable with that. So in a church setting, if somebody is disruptive and I come upon that and I'm able to respect the space, de-escalate the situation, no offense, Rob, but the first place I'm going is your office. So let's go, let's just move in and talk with Rob. Or let's find a space that, one, this is extremely accessible. And a lot of people use this space. A lot of kids, lots of opportunities for other people to get injured or involved inappropriately. So how do we do that? So trying to find a different space would be great. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So when this is going to kind of bend back on what we just got done doing with the different voices. So when you think about, or the different types of way of saying I'm sorry. So when we talk about how do we approach, how do we lower, a lot of that is going to be done non-verbally first. And then it's also going to accompany what you say verbally, obviously. But if you can create that presence, that you are there and you're calm, that peacemaker presence, which does involve confidence, if you can do that, then you're able to speak a little bit differently to the individual than perhaps if you come in a bit chaotic. So we're always communicating with our posture and our movements, our facial expressions, our eye contact, and our voice. So when you think about your eye contact, even right now, so in my classes, my students don't like it, and I've been told this multiple times, that when they say, oh, well, you have Manganello for a class, and they'll say, yeah, and then they'll just pause for a second, and then they'll say, her eyes will burn through to your soul. Exactly right. A lot of years I took offense to that. And then I thought, I've always had big eyes. People grow into their teeth. I grew into my eyes. Pictures of me as a kid, I have these huge eyes. But what it means is that we can communicate so much through our eyes. And even now, like, I'm looking for your eyes. So no offense, not a guilt trip. But if your eyes go somewhere in my mind for a second, I'm like, oh, did I say something that made them upset? Or are they tired? Or are they not? What should I do? So we're always assessing with our eyes. And we're always gaining information or substance in order to move forward with that. So being aware of your body language is pretty significant. I really appreciate the 4 of you who did that. Just a little brief example, because we can, what I liked the most is they read and interpreted what I asked them to be. So that, no offense against I'm sorry, but that didn't really matter. But it was how they had to get into the posture of an angry person, or how they had to get into the posture of somebody who's sarcastic. And in our minds, we have these examples of what we think it means to be sarcastic. And so my face, I'm sure my husband will tell you, will look totally different when I'm sarcastic than when I'm truly sorry. So it's important to remember those different things. And you all know these. And so our purpose isn't to regurgitate, to bore you. Our purpose is to say, you have these tools. You're equipped. How can we use them effectively? How can we use them well in a time where we might need to use them to de-escalate a situation? Could you please turn the slide? I don't have a good way to do that. Slide, please, maybe? Okay. I want to look at these individually just for fun for a second to give you a little bit more substance when you think about posture and movement. So I want you to think about adopting what's called a confident yet ready stance. So some of you who are very practical, which I appreciate, like blending the theory and the practical. So the theory is develop a confident yet ready stance. The practicality is that means your feet are shoulder widths apart. Why? Why would you want to get that specific and have your feet shoulder width apart? Maintain your balance, exactly right. My least favorite thing was one time I met a student and he came up to me, can I shake your hand, please? He came up and he went like this and pulled me towards him and said, hi, how you doing? And I was like, hello. And I caught off balance and I didn't like it. I didn't like it for a number of reasons, but I asked him, I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, I wanted to catch you off guard. Like I wanted to maintain control of the situation. And I said, sit down. We're going to have a conversation about this. So for me, the reason I share that example with you is when we get off balance, we can't really do anything effective. So the goal is to have a confident yet ready stance, to be ready to go, have your feet shoulder width apart. This idea that I appreciate here is 1 foot slightly behind you, again, to echo that balance, and hands where the subject can see them. So that doesn't mean you have to go like this, okay? But it does mean that perhaps you have a posture where everything is visible that could threaten or add to the threat, right? And finally, move slowly but deliberately, which is hard when you're amped up and all your adrenaline is pumping. So being able to have a catchphrase in your brain, just like the story I told you with the key fob, and if I push this, but I need to get into my car. I need to make sure that I close the door. I don't want to leave the door wide open and let the nice breeze blow in. I mean, I'm in my car. There were lots of things that I had to do deliberately to leave that situation. So how can you act in a deliberate way with your posture? Please, the next slide. When you think about, in addition to posture and movement, I group these 3 together in terms of your eye contact, your voice, and your facial expression. So using direct eye contact is important because it's going to give the subject something to focus on besides the surroundings. And so if you use direct eye contact, it's really hard to look away. That does not mean that you stare and make them feel uncomfortable. But it does mean that you have the opportunity to have direct eye contact, but every once in a while it's okay to look away as appropriate. You want to remove sunglasses, hats, any of those types of things that are going to cause any sort of distraction or inability to see your eyes and your face. So I usually remove my sunglasses, not that I get pulled over a lot, but I usually remove my sunglasses if I'm ever talking to an individual involved in the law. In addition to that, though, when I see students and I have my sunglasses on, I just take them off because there's something less mysterious about taking off your sunglasses and seeing actual eyes, and for us, actual human beings. The actual human condition is what we're trying to get this individual who has gone far beyond what it means to be human and try to find that way. When you think about eye contact, it also is important to avoid rolling your eyes or otherwise making fun of the subject. And at this point, it's kind of like, oh, wait, would you really do that? Well, I mean, if somebody if they're really amped up and they're disruptive and they're doing something that's humorous to you, chances are you might think that would be helpful, and it's not. Because the last thing you want to do is embarrass someone anyway, and especially embarrass somebody with your eye contact. Lowering your volume is a big one. A lot of us respond pretty significantly to high volume. And it's not a coincidence that when teams are warming up, they play loud music to get themselves pumped up and ready to go. Or when people are studying and trying to be a bit more relaxed, they play something quieter, right? So understanding the connection between those. Work on sounding reassuring, sympathetic, yet commanding. That's an oxymoron. It's like student teacher or jumbo shrimp, right? So the idea is, okay, wait, I have to be sympathetic, yet commanding. How do you do that with your voice? Does anybody have any practical way of being sympathetic, yet being confident and making sure that you are being commanding? How do you do that? Does anybody have an idea?
I can get one from you. Go ahead. I was going to say something. Go ahead.
On the sunglasses thing, culturally, there's some not only will you interface with people that are from the same culture. I'm sorry.
We have to follow rules. There you go. Okay.
You interface with people that will be offended by covering your eyes, not looking at it through sunglasses. They're offended by it. Your command of your voice, if you can maintain not a monotone, but a steady flow from that, they'll take nonverbal feeds from that you're not necessarily threatening. And back to the previous slide, for those of you that are like, if you're in the martial arts or if you're a firearms user, if you kind of think of the stances, that spectrum that Linda talked about going from little threat to great threat, which has violence in there, throughout this process, you need to be able to go through point 1 to point 5 that quick. And if you've maintained your balance and you can react to that, and you have a 3 to 6 foot separation, you can do that easier than if you're confronted right in there. So what I was schooled on was not a monotone, but a steady, and using your body language and your eyes. If you have rapid movements, most of the time, granted, it was involved with firearms against a hostile that I probably would have been okay with providing a kinetic solution set to. But that was my thought.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Okay, go ahead. Debbie, could you pass that back? Thank you.
I realized early on that as a salesman, people will not trust you if they cannot see your eyes. And I had those glasses that automatically darkened. They never really came back. And when I found this out, I got the clear lenses and had an economic effect too.
All right, that's good. I love that example. Thank you. Okay, Sherry, you had one?
I was just going to talk about the sympathetic commanding.
Yeah.
Maybe again with a certain student, just letting them know that I understand you have a lot going on, but whatever he did, is not acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And what that does is it allows you to identify the person for who they are as opposed to what they're doing in that moment. So I understand that you have a lot going on, but you're not condoning their actions, but yet you're seeing them as an individual. You had something too. I'm getting my steps in, which is good.
I'm a flight instructor by profession, and maybe not a confrontational role, but we deal with a lot of students that are apprehensive, especially when it comes to landing. And we have to let them control the aircraft so they can learn. So what we develop is a means of encouraging by telling them you're doing great, you're doing great. They may be completely following it up, but we're still telling them you're doing great. and then giving them very simple verbal commands. I need a little bit more rudder, a little bit more yoke, and a little bit more aileron, and encouraging them to add in whatever is necessary to accomplish that particular maneuver. And we find that works pretty well for us.
Yeah, that's a great example. And again, it's that blending of verbal and nonverbal. So, but if you start shouting, if you talk extremely fast, then you're gonna cause this disconnect between being sympathetic, but yet also being commanding. And it's not commanding in terms of, roar and lion, but it is commanding in terms of, okay, I'm gonna make sure that what we're trying to do here is what is going to be accomplished. The idea of being tactful, patient, and respectful is just as much about how you speak to the other person as it is about how you're handling your own self-talk in the de-escalation process. So if somebody says something to you, and most of the time in a de-escalation event, if I'm at the store and there's something happening, somebody's disruptive, and I choose to engage, and I make a comment that is yet tried to be sympathetic and commanding, and the individual turns to me and says, "What do you know?" So Linda would probably take that personally. But yet, what's my goal? What am I trying to do here? And I'm trying to de-escalate. So I need to be tactful, not only in the words that I choose to respond, but I also need to say to myself, don't take it personal. Understand where you are and understand what's happening. And then engage. Because I will engage much differently if I take it personally. Right? So being able to decipher between or discern between those are important. Facial expressions are big ones. I don't know how animated you are. You're all doing pretty well from my vantage point right now. But in terms of all these wonderful opportunities we have to express emotions, and God created us to do that. He didn't create us to just kind of have the same face all the time. He wants us to move it and to use it in purposeful ways. So showing empathy and understanding you can do, yes, with your eyes, with your jaw, not clenched, with those different types of examples that would have more, because of our culture, a different meaning than perhaps sympathetic or understanding. Be careful of what are called micro expressions. So from a nonverbal research end of it, we have just these kind of subconscious responses to things. And sometimes people call them nervous tics. Sometimes people call them, when we're not being very mindful of what we're doing, this just kind of comes out exactly like some kind of expression. So when you think about micro expressions, they're almost so small that you can't tell, but in a de-escalation situation, every moment counts. And everything that you need to do could end up impacting the situation significantly. Avoid showing partiality to disputing parties. So again, here comes our bias. And I know that everybody in a de-escalating situation that isn't the disruptive person should have the same goal, but a lot of times your bias has to be under control, and you have to think about, okay, in this present moment, what is my goal? And the goal is to leave this situation with the best of all parties involved in terms of their interests. Could you go to the next slide, please? So we've spent a little bit of time, go ahead and bump it to the next slide, that'd be great. We spent a little time on the nonverbal, and I want to focus a little bit on the verbal as well. Again, not to separate, to say, oh, I'm going to do my verbal de-escalation and my nonverbal, but to allow us to emphasize the importance of both and to look at them particularly individually. So from a verbal end of it, I'm a big acronym person, so I like the idea of having one word or a phrase that I can count on that's obviously going to have many more layers to meaning. So this idea, when you're thinking about 5 different steps to success, or when you're in a de-escalating situation, I want you to think about the idea of least. So least is going to stand for the steps that we would encourage you to go through in a de-escalating situation. The first is listen, empathize, ask questions, summarize, and then talk about solutions. We need to unpack each one of these effectively in order to kind of give them a little bit of substance. So if you could go to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. So step 1 is going to be listening. So verbal de-escalation is going to involve conversation. All right, so it's not just about conversation, what you do with your body. It's about conversation about what's coming out of the bottom of your mouth, and or bottom of your face. And so when you consider this idea of listening, listening is going to be active, which we talked about before. Hearing is going to be passive. It's going to be very easy for you, as well as the disruptive person, to get distracted and shut off. So you need to listen well. So I don't know if you have like a certain posture, or if somebody's like, I really need to tell you something, then you're like, game on, here we go. I need you to think about those skills or ways that you do that, both verbally and non-verbally, and I need you to think about how you can then use those or store those and associate them with this idea of least in terms of listen. So when you're thinking or you're approaching the individual and you're thinking about what to say, it sounds really kind of silly at first to say introduce yourself, but by saying your name, what could that do to the disruptive individual? If you just introduce yourself, what could that do? Trust. How so? That's good. So, right, exactly. So just trying to identify with them. So going in, introducing yourself, obviously that's going to be done definitely in your sympathetic yet commanding way, but saying who you are. And in addition to that, get and use the subject's name as much as you can. Most of the time it's reciprocal by nature as a culture. Somebody says, hi, I'm Linda. You just naturally say, oh, hi, I'm so-and-so. Or I'm so-and-so, nice to meet you. Obviously in a de-escalation situation, nice to meet you might not come out. But the idea of establishing that rapport, sometimes we're just programmed. And in those types of situations, we usually default to how we're programmed. Keep body language open and non-threatening, and ask him or her to describe what happened. This is really important because you're going to get them talking. And if you get them talking, other things can't happen. And you're also messing with the focus appropriately. So ask him or her, how did this happen? Or, ask them what's going on in terms of a description. One of my favorite things about this in terms of step one is that listening and verbal de-escalation is there's such intricate parts, but the conversation piece of it is key. And so being able to engage in a conversation with the individual is helpful. Next slide, please. Second one we're going to do is empathize. So empathy gained its, I think its fame maybe like 10 or 12 years ago as a word that people started to use. Most people got it confused. They said if you are empathetic, that means you're sympathetic. Empathy and sympathy are different. Empathy means you don't feel sorry for the person and pity them. It means you try to see it from their perspective. That's an important distinction we need to make. When you're de-escalating or you're thinking about de-escalation, you want to make sure that you, along with listening and body language, begin to use one of Ken's terms, which is echo back. Echo back this idea to show your understanding. So you want to do the best that you can to avoid saying the things that are up there like, calm down, what's your problem, you're acting crazy, things can't be that bad, or my personal favorite, you're not making sense. Even when I'm not making sense, I can guarantee you it doesn't help to have a person tell me I'm not making sense. So when you consider this idea of echo back, it means that you are required to listen to gain the appropriate knowledge of what the person is saying so that you can give it back to them to encourage that trust to form. Most of the time, if you echo back, you're going to communicate value, which if you think about from a research end of it, most people who act in a disruptive way, whether it's a kid to an elderly person, are doing it because they have lack of value or feel like they are not valued. So by acknowledging the person by name and by then empathizing or trying to understand what happened, or even just opening up a dialogue about what happened, you can then move into showing or echoing back your understanding. Next slide, please. As we continue down the list, we need to start to ask questions. This is delicate. I cannot stress that enough. Because questions most of the time are going to come across as accusatory. And in this situation, you don't want to accuse or add any kind of fuel to the flame. So you want to ask open-ended questions to get the subject talking, to get a more kind of complete picture of what's happening in the situation. Open-ended questions are often better than closed questions. So just because I'm a teacher and I want to make sure everybody's with us, open-ended means that you're going to ask questions that somebody has more than a 1 or 2 word answer to. So it's, can you tell me what's going on? As opposed to saying, are you upset? Yes. Conversation ended. So anytime you can continue to utilize open-ended questions, that's going to be beneficial. Be aware that why questions can sound extremely accusatory. So I give you some examples up there. How did you end up with the keys versus why do you have the keys? And you want to make sure that you're not trying to interrogate the subject. So although not necessarily a disruptive example, one of the things that my husband and I do with our children to appropriately interrogate them about their day is we lure them in the house with the after-school buffet of food and then say, so what happened at school today? And then they kind of start talking as opposed to, did you have a good day? Or we'll say a lot of times, like, what was something that happened that made you laugh today? Or anything that can start to get the dialogue going. Now, after school discussions and disruptive behavior, thankfully they haven't become disruptive yet. But obviously we're dealing with different tones, but you can begin to see the practical application of asking questions. Next slide, please. When you think about how we wrap this up in terms of lease, then you have the opportunity in step 4 to summarize. Sometimes people lump that together with asking questions, but if you do that, you're really missing out on an important step. Because summarizing is going to offer you the opportunity to repeat facts back from the individual's point of view, from the subject's point of view. And you're going to describe the emotion the subject is feeling. This is really important to de-escalation because it allows you to connect with the individual with what they might seem like is on their level. And so at the end of it, you're getting them talking, but if you can repeat back or echo back from their point of view, then it's going to have a much more effective outcome than perhaps if you don't and you try to put your own spin on what's happening, because we're going to naturally insert our bias even as much as we try to keep it at bay. So an example of that would be, let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. So what that is and longer sentences might be a little bit daunting to you in that type of a disruptive situation, but it allows you to take a breath and to look at that person and to say, let me see if I understand what it is that you're saying. It allows you to, from a conversation end of it, approach it and kind of take control of the conversational tone, as opposed to going, let me see if I understand, tell me. And then all of a sudden, non-verbally, we've just gone right back to escalating the situation, then de-escalating. Step 5 is talk about the solution. So slowly and quietly up there it says, suggest a resolution or act that you may want the subject to take. So when I was talking with my husband about this, I said, hey, Tone, what's an example of something that you might say to the subject when you want to talk slowly and quietly? And he said, well, understand, if you make it to that point, which is great, and that's where we want to go, and you're going to try to de-escalate the situation, and you're going to talk about the solutions, when somebody, if they are backed in the corner, if they, yes, are holding a weapon, if they're doing those different types of things, you need to think about, going back to a few slides, where are we? Am I in the middle of the sanctuary? Is Rob in his office? What are my options to consider? And so when you move slowly and quietly, when you say that, suggesting this resolution, you can encourage the subject that this is the best thing that he or she can do right now. So you can make a comment after you've repeated back what they've said, and then say, this is a good time for us to go and see Rob. Why don't we take just a minute and go and get Rob's perspective, or just to allow it to get out of that environment that has caused some escalation. I really want to make sure that we focus also on some tactics to avoid. So if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So shouting, giving rapid commands, lying, tricking, or deceiving anyway are terrible, but definitely in a de-escalation environment. Making promises you can't keep is probably one of the most difficult, because you just want to get out of there, and probably so do they. So if somebody says, well, I want this, or I need to do that, or why can't you do this to me? Or do this for me. It's not about promises. It's about communicating in a way that you can help them to get to the de-escalation by not lying or tricking, by not giving rapid commands, and by doing it in a manner that won't seem threatening. The last thing that we're going to cover somewhat quickly is dealing with your own personal control. So this is going to happen kind of in the midst of your interactions. So if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Next one, thanks. You're catching. That's good. Thank you. I appreciate it. All right. So points to remember. One of my favorite things. Aunt Debbie said this the other day. When we were at dinner, she said Ken's talking about going lizard brain again. And so if you've been to a number of sessions with Ken, you've heard of this idea called lizard brain. Lizard brain, or reptilian brain, as Tony and I first came into contact with in our premarital counseling. And that's not somebody like, whoa, I need to go talk to that premarital counselor. It was really interesting. We were talking about conflict resolution, and the premarital counselor said to us, just don't go reptilian. So he caught our attention because I was like, what does that mean? So in terms of the way that our brain is structured, so in the front of your brain, or in this area here, is where the frontal lobe, or the new brain, is where you do all of your logical, kind of controlled, productive thinking. If you travel down the brain, almost at the base of your skull, there's this little tiny reptilian brain, is what it's called. And it is focused on survival. So it's focused on helping you breathe, so you don't always have to remember to do that. It's when you're asleep, it's making sure that you're resting, all those different types of things. Survival mode is the job of the reptilian brain, or the lizard brain. So remember earlier I talked about counting to 10. So you're in a situation that has escalated. You are freaking out. Adrenaline is going through all parts of your body, right? You feel like, for my Marvel comic fans, you feel like Bruce Banner, like the Hulk. I mean, that's what's happening to you. What's happening is blood and adrenaline are leaving to go to the other areas of the body that are calling it, are leaving that frontal lobe new brain, traveling down and fueling your reptilian brain. So what do you think your thoughts are going to be focused on? Survival. So by counting to 10, what you're doing is allowing yourself the opportunity to exhale, which is probably one of the most difficult things that I've talked to you about today, is by identifying, hey, I'm going reptilian. I'm going reptilian in traffic. I'm going reptilian on my spouse. I'm going reptilian on my kids. I'm going reptilian on the cashier because they're not moving fast enough. I mean, everything in the world is out to get you, and that's how you feel when you go reptilian. So you want to make sure that you're mindful of your lizard brain, and you give yourself 10 seconds, is what research tells us, to breathe and to calm down, and to allow all of that blood and adrenaline to be equally dispersed so that the frontal lobe, the new brain, can have a piece in the game again. And I like my reptilian brain, very thankful for it, but I don't want to operate on a daily basis with my reptilian brain only. Be patient and aware of your hot buttons. So this is an interesting one. I don't know if any of you have, I can get that. It's okay. Here, let me get that. If any of you have a particular hot button, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. So in our house, if somebody sighs, that's a hot button. The sigh-rolled eye combination, people go off the charts. So you want to make sure that you are, remember I told you the more you know about yourself, the more effective you're going to be as a communicator. I understand we all have hot buttons, but the more that you know that, okay, that's going to frustrate me. And the more you're able to communicate that with people in your relational world, the better off you're going to be when those types of situations occur. Do not try to demand respect, which goes against our natural instincts. When somebody is disruptive, we feel like, okay, it's my job. I'm going to go all 5'3" of me, or 5'5", depending on the heels I have on. I'm going to control. I'm not going to go in and demand respect, because that's going to put me in a different posture than what would be favorable in terms of de-escalation. Avoid taking anything personally and resist talking back, which for the baby of the family is really difficult to do. I'm my grandfather's granddaughter for sure, and he had a wit that was unbelievable and timing that could just zing ya. And I've been told that I can do that as well. So I need to make sure that I resist talking back. Respect the subject's dignity, which is a big part. From our end of it in our family, we talk a lot about finding the Jesus in the person. So when our daughters come home from school and they've had an interaction with somebody who's been disruptive, they'll say to us, I tried to find the Jesus in them. I tried to find something about them that I could recognize them as a creation of God rather than all the venom that was coming out of them at that time. So dignity plays a pretty significant role in that. And avoid controlling statements. Let's head over to the next slide, please. I'm almost done sliding you, I promise. Overall, when I was talking with Ken a little bit about this, it's ironic that the logic of de-escalation would be the following. So be less authoritative. Wait, what? Be less confrontational. Insert the wait, what? Be less controlling. I need to take control of the situation, but you'll actually have more control. As I was preparing this discussion, I had our daughters around us, and I had shared this with Ken prior. I said to Lucy and Sophie, I said, so talk to me about what it feels like to go from being really amped up to feeling calm. What helps you? And so our youngest said, color. I think in colors, Mom. I said, okay, well, please tell me some more. When I'm mad, I think red. And don't get me wrong, I like red. Red's a pretty color. Valentine's Day, red, we like red. But when I'm mad, I think of red. But yet when I'm more calm, I think of blue or green. And then our oldest chimed in and said, like a stoplight. I said, yes, like a stoplight. So a lot of times we think of the wrong way to engage because unfortunately sometimes that's how culture would encourage us to do that. So we should control. We should be authoritarian. We should, authoritative. We should go in with loud volume. But if you go in yelling and match that with somebody who's already disruptive, it's going to have a much different outcome than if you apply some of these techniques. I'd love to, and I'm glad we did. We've got some time left for questions or comments. And so what I would love to do is to listen to some of the ideas that really struck a nerve with you. I'd love to understand some of the experiences perhaps that you've had where you have been involved in de-escalation. And Ken and I know, would really appreciate your feedback on this information. So I've got my microphone, which can be kind of intimidating, but you're doing fine with that. So you're going to take this? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. All right. So
Here.
Oh, okay.
He leaned over to his bride, and I thought he had something he wanted to say.
See, I wouldn't have put you on the spot like that. I'm a much, yeah.
What would you like to hear?
Taking requests.
Overall impression. I really enjoyed what you shared with us
Thanks.
today. And I felt like I was back in my sales class, teaching students how to be proper salespeople. Mm-hmm. Techniques are the same. You know, we hear it in so many different ways. And even though this is presented in a way that could be very confrontational, it's basically life. And it's excellent tools to have in virtually every circumstance. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Linda, I was having a conversation with a person from a church outside of our area. At the conclusion of the service, the pastor had done the benediction, and somebody up in the balcony yelled out, "Suicide is a growing epidemic." You know, then they said the word suicide, and the whole room just kind of froze. And then they said, you know, that Indiana is one of the highest suicide rates in the country, that kind of thing. How could the pastor have handled that in a way that would help de-escalate that disruption? I'm just curious what, after we've listened.
Yeah, that's
to
a great,
her,
I mean, what do you
I'd love to
think?
hear what people's thoughts, if that happened in your church, what would happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you think? You've listened to me enough. I'd love to listen to you. What do you think?
Let's talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
No,
They're recording it, so we gotta.
I mean, if maybe get him to talk more about it. I mean, maybe that was an open opportunity for everyone to kind of chime in.
What else?
Erin has something.
As nurses, you know, we would sometimes get agitated patients or families or whatever.
Yeah.
They always told us, like if we went into the room, to make sure the door was behind us, you know, that we weren't trapped in the room. Did you say that? Did I miss it?
No, that's good.
But that you could get out of the room quickly if something, you know, really serious started to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rob, you posed the question, and I think it leads to not the taglines or buzzwords or anything like that. You echo it back. Suicide. Oh, interesting. What do you have about that? And you can immediately, just by that question, well, what do you mean by, what is that? You get them involved in the conversation. So instead of what was obviously an emotional and pre-planned, probably premeditated suicide, trying to put someone on the spot, you bring them back in. Conversely, taking control of the situation and putting them on the spot, which I enjoy doing that, making people uncomfortable. I'm being sarcastic. Actually, I'm not. But it's the echo back. How can I? My wife, and we did this in HR in the Army, when you get turn everything back around and say, no, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your service. Get that a lot as a veteran. And I said, thank you for having a country that was worth serving. I sincerely mean that, but it turns it right around and you've now established a rapport in that and saying, okay. A recent experience when these pieces of oxygen thief were kneeling during the national anthem during the NFL season instead of, those oxygen thieves. And people going, well, what do you think about that? And they were expecting me to go, oh no, you just need to round them all up and, terminate them. And I'm like sitting there with my thoughts. How is it some grown man wearing a costume is going to invoke a response from me? By giving up an emotional response to it, you take control, and that's the game I play. Take control by giving up your desire to control it, because you can do that. You can go from 1 to 5 that quick if you're physically capable, if you've got the right arm limit. You can do that. But is that necessary? And what do you have at the end? Someone who's destroyed, damaged, or may not be able to be brought back to contribute in the way you want. And sometimes it's just honest mistake. It's like, okay, how is that going to invoke a response from you? Is it really that sort of thing that's going to force you to have that emotional response? Spent a lot of time interfacing with multinationals that didn't speak my language, trying to do this particular skill set, which I'm not real good at, through an interpreter. But I could be dominating in some respects without becoming overwhelming. 6'4" in the morning, I know by evening I'm 6'3", a hand on a sidearm, eye-to-eye contact, not overwhelming, and since normally it was in a male-dominant society, speaking in that same way, and you can control that situation and not have it escalate, whether you're talking to Taliban or Al-Qaeda, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And so I just take the echo back to them. And that's why I kind of it's like, yeah, I can relate to that. Of everything you talk about, because I spend most of my life operating in the lizard brain, not being able to be cognitive. To sit there, how do you do it? You echo it back.
Well, and if that happened, if that happened here, like this morning, if somebody just stood up and screamed that, thinking about if I'm in my seat, so we sat over there today, so I would have, the first thought would be, what just happened? What is this individual doing? Why are they doing that? And most of the time, people who would choose this environment to speak out like that, there's got to be obviously much more on the surface, but the attention is what they would like at that time. So attention for whatever, for suicide, or if somebody yelled something, I mean, any of those horrific experiences, and they're going to go ahead and say that, non-verbally, you would see a shift in the congregation. So if somebody got up and screamed that, everybody would react because it affects you, it impacts you. So to answer your question, how would I encourage the pastor to react? In an environment like that, you obviously, in a lot of ways, defer to the leadership or the people who know the area best And so the pastor's mic, not to put it all on your shoulders, but if that happened in our church, my guess is you would respond. And obviously you would try to be sympathetic, but yet you would make sure that you have this command or this ability to appropriately control for all parties involved, including the individual who yelled that.
What that pastor did is acknowledge that is a very growing problem, and we as a congregation need to be aware of that. We need to be praying for people, and if we know somebody that's having some mental health issues, please refer them to the appropriate authorities, and if you don't know who they would be, please come and see me, and then dismissed everybody with a prayer. That's exactly the right way to de-escalate that kind of tense situation.
Besides doing that, perhaps he could say, how about we meet and talk after church?
Mm-hmm.
You know, all that you've said, and then try to meet with him and, yeah.
In that particular setting, when you have, let's say this whole place was full and that happened. So, I mean, encouraging kind of, it's like anything. We said sales a couple of times. If you're going to correct somebody who's one of your salespeople, you don't do that in front of everybody else. So it's not about engaging in verbal judo or bantering or trying to go toe-to-toe with the individual who's clearly disruptive. So how do you do that? And so your suggestions, Rob, and then the additional one of, you know, taking the spotlight off or meeting in a different area can be helpful. Yeah.
The other thing I think about in that situation is, okay, you've got the congregation. Now, is this person going to commit suicide, or does he want to shoot people? So what is the pastor's responsibility, or the other people, for everybody in the congregation at that time? You know, most of us haven't been trained in that. Well, here in this class, we've been trained. But I mean, most people don't know what to do.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments or takeaways? I'd love to hear some of this.
We had a situation in church where a young lady overdosed on drugs, and my wife and I, we both worked for the sheriff's department for a while, so kind of fell on our shoulders to help out. But we know her personally, so while Carol was calming her down and trying to get her to go to the hospital for treatment, so I was keeping everybody else kind of away, but everybody else wanted to help, and so therefore when the sheriff's department and the EMTs came, she was afraid they were going to take her to jail because she was paranoid. And so finally Carol convinced her to ride with her in the car with the pastor and everything. So took her to the hospital, and at the hospital then she was refusing treatment. So there I stepped in, and I went in and I told her, I said, look, you want to see your son? Well, yeah. Well, then you better get treatment, because otherwise by morning you're going to be dead. Seriously. And that calmed her down enough that she submitted to treatment, and she was okay, because even the doctor said that she would not have survived the night.
Yeah, absolutely. And that example and that story is helpful because it identifies the connection that was, and the sympathetic the approach at times, but ultimately empathetic. So you got into her shoes. Well, what's important to her? Her son.
Right.
And so showing that empathy was really important and ended up changing it completely.
But all your suggestions and little hints and stuff like that was everything that we had been doing unconsciously. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate that. Anybody else have any takeaways or anything? Yeah.
In a society, particularly with the logic of de-escalation that you talked about in the previous slide, in a society that tells my generation, kids younger than me, no, you need to have authority, you need to have a control. How do we train our minds to get away from all this social media as we have so much access to it? And how do we train us to get outside of that mindset and raise generations to be able to do and live at, like you guys have and how you're teaching us in this seminar, but how to continue teaching us to get outside of what the culture keeps teaching us.
That's a great question. What do you think? How do we help with that?
I think it's intentional relationships with younger folks, and in the midst of that, kind of intentionally saying, hey, you know, I'm going to show you something I've learned. I see that when you're interacting with your peers, maybe that things kind of get ramped up. Let me give you I'm going to show you a couple of tricks here. and I think in that context of relational connection, that there's that value added. Wow, they do care about me. And then I think there's that when they actually put that into place, they're going like, oh, and they may in turn then share that with their friends. So they like, wow, you turn that whole thing around in a couple of simple ways. And so I think that intentionally having relationships where you can teach that. You've done that with your daughters, okay? You've intentionally poured into them the opportunity to help de-escalate situations that are part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And I think that intentional relationship, my observation.
Yeah, and social media gives us this kind of pseudo community in some ways. I'm not bashing social media, but I mean,
no, go ahead.
You can, but a lot of times we feel that we are connected, but then when we truly need someone, it doesn't compute to like or to unlike or to comment on a status. And so what Rob had commented on with the value, that's at the core, those intentional relationships. And so how do we do that? I mean, it's in the details. It's in the way that you communicate and interact with people and how you see them. And we probably will mess it up, but if we acknowledge that our goal is to move forward and to speak value into other people, that's a great place to start. And it does involve all those least in a lot of ways, the listening, the empathizing, those things. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions, folks, or takeaways? I appreciate you sticking with me through this.
Linda, I think as a pastor, you've helped me be intentional about putting this in place in premarital counseling, some of these things. I talk about, fighting, but I don't go through some of this, and I think this is a good add-on in terms of premarital counseling. I talk about fighting fair, and I talk about fighting forward, but putting least in the kind of the mix of that might be a good add-on for me.
Yeah.
And then family systems and learning how to, kind of help family systems deal with the conflict that happens, like, I don't know, maybe nobody else's families have this happen, like Thanksgiving and Christmas. What wonderful times to get your family together, right? Nobody else has tension around the table. We do at the Neal House. Anyway, and being able to put some of this in place in the midst of, family gatherings.
Well, and we run the risk because, I mean, a lot of this stuff, my guess is you're familiar with. When Ken and I put this together, we didn't expect a bunch of epiphanies to happen. But we did encourage you to identify how desensitized we can come to things that we do every day. So communicating our tone, saying I'm sorry, how do we do that? What's going on with your face? I mean, those different types of things are all very important because it becomes a habit. So I always would say I could have played ball better in college than I did if somebody would have told me my chicken arm, just go under, Linda. The elbow when you're shooting your basket goes right underneath your hand. But I practiced like this. So, and it would go in probably, I don't know, Dad, what, maybe like 5 out of 10 times. Not earth-shattering. But I practiced like that. Same thing with our words, same things with our nonverbals, the way that we communicate. If we practice poor communication, then the quality of our life is going to be dramatically impacted. Go ahead.
What you just said really comes into my point. Is that it's often said that in an emergency you will react to your lowest level of training and your lowest level of reaction, and you think all this fantastic stuff that you're going to do, but you don't really do it that way. And so in the same level of de-escalation, and breath control is primary here, as you're well aware. And so it's a matter of practicing that breath control over and over again. And for myself, I have a signal for myself that when I do a certain thing, it is a signal to me, that take a deep breath and slow down. And and it doesn't come. It only comes with practice. It only comes with intentionality.
Right.
So it's something that when they talk about church safety and all this stuff with train, it really comes down to train. You know, and this is a case where you have to train yourself, and even if it comes standing in front of a mirror and watching yourself do these things, it would help you so that when that moment might come, that you'll have this built-in reaction for yourself, so that you won't have to think about. Let's see, what was number 3 on the slide? You know,
Sure.
But it'll just happen naturally. But you got to train for it to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. That's helpful feedback. I mean, doing something, practicing it over and over so it does become your default, essentially, so that if something does happen and it goes sideways, it's not, oh, I can get my super costume on to be the superhero. It's, what have I practiced? What do I think? What do I know? And that's going to make a difference between freezing and the ability to move. Go ahead.
And that also comes into this whole thing of assurance and confidence, you know, because I know what I can do, you know, and whether you believe it or not, you can argue this, but I think that those things would just come out in all of your expression and all your actions and your attitudes if I know for sure what I know I can do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good.
I was just going to say, I'm a teacher, is my profession, and I've had multiple administrators encourage me to de-escalate situations, because my natural instinct is to what I call snap into teacher mode. If I see a kid in the hallway and I say, you got to take off your hat, and they comply, everything's fine and dandy, and I'm very non-confrontational. And then if I see them take 5 steps and put it back on again, the last thing I'm interested in doing is de-escalating the situation. You know, to me it's kind of like game on. And yet I understand what they're saying, because at least I think I understand. I'm not sure I agree all the time, and I know that this isn't necessarily set up in a situation. I would like to think that I could read a situation, and a kid, whether he has his hat on or if he's on his cell phone in class, it's a whole lot different than making verbal threats to physical threats to other things. But some of it's just trying to, I guess, trying to figure out where the situations are. And I guess maybe that's what a question I have is, I know that if you ask a colonel, when you were in the Army and you were giving orders, de-escalation was not appropriate at the time. You know, the private had to obey, and had to obey immediately, if not sooner. And so I'm trying to think of, again, carrying this to other situations, because I know in today's society it might be a kid wearing a hat and he gets ticked, and the next day he comes in and decides to make poor choices, regardless what those poor choices are. And so I guess the question is how do you figure out when de-escalation is appropriate and when it isn't? And I realize even my parenting technique, there are times that I get into that teacher mode with my kids, and what maybe could have been a very small situation, I have now made a major case, and it shouldn't have been. And just trying to figure out, I guess the bottom line, when I look at myself, I feel like I'm losing power, losing control of the situation if I do not see that obedience. And again, I know I'm kind of taken down a rabbit hole, because that's not exactly what the presentation was. But I guess in some ways I could bring that rabbit trail back. And so anyhow, any thoughts of if there are certain times that no, it's, you know, obedience is important, and other times it's better to err on
Yeah. Well, and for my initial reaction is, what's your goal? And I don't mean to answer your question with a question, but in terms of allowing you to process and think. So with the kid in the hallway that has the hat, hey, hats aren't allowed, please take your hat off. You know, and so the hat goes off, and then you look back, and halfway down the hall, the hat's back on. It's so disrespectful. I mean, really, and if you can't, I mean, my head is just filled with all of those. Come on. But the goal is the goal to really get the kid to take his hat off? No, the goal is to get the kid to understand why, and also to find to give some sort of meaning to a rule. None of us really like rules. I don't know about you. I mean, I understand rules, and rules are important, but when I have rules, that just kind of takes the fun out of it, I think, is the first thing and first reaction that I have. So I like my hat. I want to wear my hat. Well, hats aren't allowed in school. Why? Well, and then to give an answer. But I liked the connection over here, too. And with your students, you obviously have that opportunity to know them. And I don't know you well, but I'm getting the fact that you like to know your students. And so you could try to connect on their level if that's your goal. If your goal is to change the heart of this young man, it might just start with taking the hat off. Not to get all Mr. Miyagi on you and the Karate Kid, but it wasn't about washing a car, wax on, wax off. It was about delivering the skills and the mindset and kind of crafting and shaping that in the individual. It sounds a bit fortune cookie, and that's not where I'm trying to take you. But I want you to consider your goal can change on any given day because of our emotions. But overall, you're a teacher because you want to change the lives of these young men and women that you have the privilege of being with, even if at times it's not a privilege in your mind because they're being disrespectful. But yes, you're the adult. How do you engage in a way that's going to be effective? Defaulting to some of these tactics are very important, but I think if you believe in the idea of, okay, what's my goal with this young man? And that answer is then going to impact which course of action you take. You have comments, I know you do.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're getting ready to finish up. We promised to keep it to 2 hours. Some underpinnings, I just heard from it. There's some underpinnings. Here is it. You're thinking about it. 30 seconds of thought while you're in your frontal lobe, cognitive brain, will give you a lot of headway when you immediately start operating in your lizard brain because you've lost your cognitive ability. You talk about thinking about, gentlemen, suspicious, car, situation, that doesn't feel right. Let me think what I would respond. My wife, the night staying up after the Florida shooting, what would I do in my classroom on that? If you put that thought to it, asking the questions, how do I do it? How do I keep this dopamine addicted social media, because that's what it is, it's a drug. It literally releases a chemical. How do I address that as I start to mature further in my lifestyle? Thinking about it is the first step. I'm a crude person, so I just put it like this. Do you want the State Department to do that fluff and buff diplomatic stuff before you have to go in and provide a terminal solution set to a conflict? Yes, you do. Try this. Figure out how you're going to approach to do it, because you can go to level 5 that quick, but the result is it's finished. There's no opportunity with you as Christians trying to live a life with Christ to assist someone to realize their ability to have a life with Christ if you terminate the situation. That's what makes it different from combat on a battlefield or engagement in so many other areas. It is, we're trying to do it with an underpinning of faith that all life is worth attempting to work with. That's my approach to it. But then I'm just a knuckle dragger, so don't take me too seriously.
No, I like that. Well, and it gives him kind of both perspectives in terms of substance.
Thinking about it will get you
That's a great
way
question.
instead of just reacting when it happens.
It's hard. It takes effort. I mean, it's easier to just go to 5. Be done with it. Over. But, oh my goodness. So, I mean, this isn't easy.
We're going to say thank you. Linda, thank you very much. And if you appreciate it, please.
Thank you.
Yes. This is someone who does this. This is a background, a skill set, academic credentials for doing it. To just consider this. I would ask you to consider it in your effort, whether it's in your church, your faith-based organization, or even your approach. I know my wife has used it in school the day after I rudely and very unelegantly attempted to provide this to St. Paul School. It's like, you'll find that this actually has application when you're interfacing with your grandkids also, or if you're still young enough to have kids. We're not. But with the grandkids, it's got application with just about everything you interface with. So thank you. And thank
You're
you
welcome.
for bringing some elegance to the presentation of this.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you very
absolutely.
much.
Absolutely. Let's close up our time in prayer, and then you all can head on out. But thank you so much for coming today. Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to come together and with hope and to actually understand more about these wonderful bodies that you've given us, Lord, in terms of our skills and our gifts and our talents. Thank you for the good questions and the good feedback and the experiences that are representative in this room. And I just pray, Father, that you would be with each man and woman as they leave today. Equip them, encourage them, and speak into them, Father, in the ways that you've created them with value and with just ultimate goal for your service and your will to be done, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Great. Thank you very much.